The nonprofit MBA purpose is to provide new business insights and fresh creative ideas for executive directors and their teams that will help them improve their organization. Here is your host, Stephen Halasnik.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Halasnik. I'll be your host for today's Nonprofit MBA podcast, as I have been for 300 episodes, and I am the co-founder of Financing Solutions. And for the last 13 years, Financing Solutions has been the leading provider of lines of credit to small nonprofits in the United States. Yes, there is a company specifically that does that, and we are that company, and we've been doing it for a long time. We have, thousands of clients. And if you're interested in learning more about a line of credit for your nonprofit, please visit our website at nonprofitmbapodcast.com. We have a sponsor for today. It's a Raise Fast Fund Online. It is accounting software that's specifically made for small to medium-sized nonprofits. It's accounting software. It has fundraising modules, as a payroll module. It's all together one single product. It's designed specifically by CPAs who've been involved with nonprofits for ages. It's really good. I use it for one of my other nonprofits that I'm a board member on. It's araize.com if you want to visit them, araize.com. And today, we're going to be talking about build strong volunteer programs to match your vision, values, and goals, or how to build strong volunteer programs to match your vision, values, and goals. And I'd like to welcome in Perry Radford. And Perry is the founder of and principal of Rad Philanthropy. Perry, help me out again because I got the word wrong again. I can't believe it.
No, it's okay. I mistype it at least a couple times a week myself. It's
Philanthropy.
Philanthropy.
There we go. I for those listeners, I have dyslexia, so I sometimes mispronounce words. So as a fundraising consultant and coach, Perry helps nonprofits develop strategies, systems, and relationships that help them improve their fundraising yield. Perry supports fundraising organizations as interim staff, serves as also strategic counsel, manages key projects, and leads team building workshops that brings groups closer to each other and their purpose. Perry, welcome to today's Nonprofit MBA podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here and talk about this topic.
So why have you seen that volunteer programs are so important to nonprofits, other than, the free labor? I mean, have you seen a direct correlation between very well-run nonprofits and volunteer programs that are really good?
Well, yes and no, because some nonprofits are better structured to have volunteer programs than others.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that when it comes to volunteers, and all nonprofits are going to have them because they have a board at the end of the day, right? At the very least. Managing your volunteers and how you work with them is the core of what we do in nonprofit and philanthropy, because it's relationship and it's community building. Everything we do in nonprofit goes to the people whose lives we are connected to, that we are trying to make a change for and with. So volunteers are really fundamental to what we do because of that. Now, beyond that, we know America is the country of volunteers, right? Even as volunteerism has supposedly declined over the decades, there's different estimates out there, but most sources are saying maybe 60 to 80 million US adults volunteer. So that's about a quarter of our population is volunteering. And through that volunteer work, they are generating maybe 120 to 180 billion dollars of equivalent of economic output in what they're contributing. So we really don't want to underestimate how important our volunteers and our relationships with them are, because they drive so much of what they do, but it's also really definitional of what we do in nonprofit and philanthropy.
Yeah. Do you think I just joined a soup kitchen, and I volunteered there, and they have so many volunteers.
And it's one of the most popular ways to volunteer.
Yeah, I believe it. And, I volunteered, and I signed up for a couple different things, and you have to sign up immediately because it goes so fast.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, I'm at my computer all the time, so it's not bad. But I also, I this was an organization I already donated money to.
Mm-hmm.
I do it on a reoccurring monthly basis. But I also, as soon as I went on there, I got a golfing foursome to as part of their charity event that they're doing. It certainly dawned on me that volunteering allows you to raise money.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Yeah,
fair?
I mean, volunteerism is a gateway. It's a gateway drug, I guess you could say, to greater investment and involvement. So, again, there's different estimates out there, but a lot of people agree volunteers are twice as likely to donate to a nonprofit than anybody else who's just in the neighborhood. And as you've seen, volunteers really become your best advocates. Through the work you do as a volunteer, you become more invested in the nonprofit's success. You have your own story and connection to that nonprofit. And it makes it a lot easier because of that relationship that you're now forming for that nonprofit to come back and ask you for other types of help. What do they need? Do they need you to ask your friends to help fundraise, like the golf tournament that you're talking about? Do they know you have experience as a board member and you could really help them in that way? The more you deepen that relationship with your volunteers, the more specifically they are going to be able to aid you with whatever gifts they have in their life. We all have a lot of different ways that we can contribute. I talk about the acts of giving. So, time, talent, treasure, testimony, and ties. And I think one thing a lot of nonprofits do wrong is they only ask for treasure, they don't ask for the other acts of giving. But volunteers are really kind of the great equalizers because they can end up giving everything when they are really connected to an organization. And more importantly, they can give, what they are best equipped or are most accessible to give. We don't want to diminish anyone because of the gifts that they are able or not able to give. Any sort of gift can be valuable in a different way, and it really depends on what does the organization need, and am I the right person at the right moment to be able to provide that?
Yeah, I think my early guess is that there's a direct correlation between this. I think there's a direct correlation between the strength of your volunteer organization and the strength of your internal operations as well. I can't see that you could have a strong volunteer organization and that your internal operation isn't also well because you don't. It's like you don't build the nonprofit with the volunteers first. So if you have experience in building um, the internal operation well, it then reflects the volunteer organization and not the vice versa. Like, is
Well,
that,
I
have you
think
noticed that or no?
I think the thing is that volunteerism is inherently action oriented. So because volunteerism is going to make your organization proactive in some way, that means, you can't just like let it rip. You need to,
Yeah.
you need to come up with business practices. You need to figure out your compliance. You need to have your operations together. And so I think it can be a little bit of a chicken and an egg, but I think volunteerism really fuels what you do. Like I think about, one of the types of nonprofits I'm into supporting are animal rescue nonprofits. And those are so volunteer driven with like the fostering and the rescuing that takes place, right? And a lot of those really start, I think, to kind of the counter example. They start as volunteers first, but they get how to do it. They learn how to work with the local shelters. They learn how to work with adopters and with vets. And then from there, they can build out really straightforward operations to, get as many animals healthy and into homes as possible. But the vice versa can be true as well. If you have a great idea, you have a vision, you build relationships with people who are ready to come along, you can activate people that way too.
So a lot of our listeners are smaller nonprofits,
Hmm.
and so I can see like an executive director listening to this who is saying, I need to build my volunteer organization. I need to build one, really, or I need to build a better one. Um, but I can also see that their heads are spinning because they're like, what else could I put on my plate?
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, volunteer management can be quite burdensome. There are parts of it, because it is relational, that are hard to scale. And so I think when it comes to volunteerism, if your nonprofit is operating and it's quite challenging and you don't have volunteers already, like, don't just do it to do it. My real thinking here is that it's important to be intentional and strategic about how you bring in, how you create, how you evaluate, how you evolve your volunteer programs. And so what I think about is a few step process to make sure that you are creating the volunteer program that is going to help you maximize your reach, maximize your impact, get closer to achieving your mission. So in my mind, the steps to coming up with a intentional volunteer program for an organization are knowing yourself, determining the problem you are solving, defining your outcomes, relationships and culture, and then coming up with a program
I
plan.
like it.
So I can
Yeah.
talk through each of those steps a little bit more as we go through this conversation, but I think they're really important in figuring out the answer of what is the right volunteer program for you at a specific organization.
Yeah. I think my first reaction would be, I mean, I like your methodology because it had what I was thinking of, and that is come up with two or three things that you would really want that volunteer organization to accomplish, and then I would personally delegate it to one of the people I know who want to volunteer, who is a go getter, and
To-
say, I'm going to delegate this to you. These are the three things I'm looking for. This is how we're going to measure it. And then and this is the time frame that we are going to have things that I want things done by, or whatever involved. So you have the SMART goals. It's called specific, measurable,
exactly.
attainable, results oriented, and I forget what the T is, but time sensitive,
Timely.
timely, right? um, but then backing into your other methodology that you have, because in there it goes back to the idea that I had, is that by having a strong volunteer organization, it could also make you have a strong internal operation. And because the methodology that you have talked about, you defined your culture? Have you defined your purpose? If you haven't done that, well, you're going to have to do that. So what were the 5 steps again that you had?
Yeah, so it's knowing yourself, the problem you're solving, defined outcomes, relationships and culture, and volunteer program plan.
Okay.
Now, some of it is a little bit iterative, and you have this kind of chicken and egg issue where you have to kind of work forwards and work backwards because, you might have a great idea as an executive director about a volunteer program, but you don't have any data about it. You might do all this footwork to put out this new volunteer program, and guess what? The people on your email list don't care about it or aren't interested in it, or it's not happening at a time where they can do their volunteer commitment. So it's really important to kind of have this process where you're going back and forth and checking yourself as you come up with a plan so that you're not doing this heavy, 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 heavy lift of volunteer management for very little return. So it all starts with knowing yourself.
Yeah.
So, what kind of organization are you? What's your mission? Who do you serve? Who's in your community? But then there's these other pieces as well, like what's your character and personality as an organization? What's your brand? Who gets you? Because your volunteer program has to really be an extension of that. If you have a very formal brand, like, say, for an example, a museum, and then your volunteer program is all about fun and parties, that might work or that might be a mismatch. So, really having a good understanding of what you do as an organization, how you talk about yourself, that's all really going to be your North Star for figuring out what should my volunteer program feel like? How can it be a reflection of what's already inherent and true about my nonprofit organization?
Yeah, I let me ask you this question, and that is, um, how many of the nonprofits that you've worked with that are smaller, so let's say under 5 million revenue,
Hmm.
are they haven't done a good job. They haven't done the first four steps. Is that an unusual thing for someone to not know who they are? Is it an unusual thing for them to not understand their culture?
I think it really depends the organization that you're working with. I would say most of my experience is actually with very large nonprofits. My background is in higher education. Eh, That being said, if you've read any mission statements of universities recently, they are some of the most nebulous, convoluted mission statements out there because universities do everything. They are educating people in liberal arts colleges, they're educating people in professional schools, they have medical centers, there's student life, they have quite big real estate and investment portfolios. So, what happens in that situation, it's interesting because you think the bigger and more complex it is, the more
Mm.
clear the answer should be, but that's not always the case. When you are really small and you have a very clear, narrow lane that you are in some ways that makes it easier. Your answer is right in front of you. I've started a nonprofit to rescue animals in my communities. It's really clear who you help and who you don't help. I don't help people 2 states over. I help people and animals right here where I live, versus in a really large nonprofit. I actually think it can get away from you, and it becomes a lot harder to be clear on what is going to help you maximize your impact, because there's so many different points you're trying to make an impact in.
Yeah, I get it. There's a reason why they're so big too, because they're diversified in a whole bunch of different things.
Hmm.
I think there is a correlation. I've started a number of businesses, and there's a direct correlation between a company getting over $3 million in revenue and their ability to have already put the groundwork into knowing their mission, their purpose, and their culture.
Hmm.
So, so when I started, I've been doing my own businesses for 30 years, and I've started 7 companies, and there is a correlation that I've seen between business owners who have done the work in understanding their mission, their core values, and growing bigger, faster. So if your objective as a nonprofit is to grow faster, I think as a small nonprofit, I don't care. You like the reason I'm saying is you might say to yourself, you know what? I'll do that stuff when I'm $1 million in revenue,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
I would counsel you not to do that stuff. Do it now when you're
Hmm.
$50,000 in revenue, $100,000 in revenue. And if you're $1 million in revenue and you haven't done it, then take a step back and understand it. And then you can go back at the volunteer programs that we're talking about today. It wouldn't take you long, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally in nonprofit, we are purpose driven. And if you aren't clear on your purpose, you aren't clear on your values, it's the if you stand how does that quote go? You stand for nothing, you fall for everything. You need to have your clarity of purpose and who you are to make that difference you're seeking to make. Otherwise, it's just a vanity project.
Yeah, it's funny. Companies for-profit companies need to develop and understand a purpose-driven mission statement. And I'm not saying that nonprofits don't as well. That comes more natural to them. They actually need to develop a financial plan, so it's like that's something that's kind of foreign to them. And I think it doesn't, they don't like the taste of that. But the fact of the matter is, if you're going to help the people
Hmm.
or the cause that you want to help, unfortunately, there's a financial component to it as well.
Oh,
And yeah,
100%.
yeah.
I think the next thing to think about is when it comes to having a volunteer program, there can be a challenge in differentiating the right problem for your volunteers to solve. So sometimes your nonprofit, your volunteers are working on the exact problem that is your mission. and other times it's more indirect. So the great examples of that are, what you talked about with your service earlier, like a local food pantry or soup kitchen. You are directly, as a volunteer, doing the service that's a nonprofit, it is working on. You are the one helping them alleviate hunger. In my world, where I've spent a lot of time in higher education, a lot of the volunteerism is so much more indirect. For those very long mission statements the schools have, fundamentally, it's educating some group of people to be a leader in a global society, blah, 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 whatever, right? Are the volunteers doing that? No. Volunteers, they might be mentoring students. They might be getting their fellow classmates to give as fundraising ambassadors. There's other ways that they're helping that support the overall mission, but they're not doing that core function of the work. And so when it comes to this question of knowing yourself and your values, you can extend that to this question of, how do I work with volunteers? What is the problem they can help us solve that's going to make the most sense for us?
Yeah, I can. It made me think too that in that education example, are those volunteer programs well run?
It really depends. It
Yeah.
really depends on the institution. Some schools have amazing, flourishing mentorship programs. Others, because there's just so much more of a demand today in higher education for career-focused outcomes. A lot of schools are preparing for that now and trying to figure out, how can we tap into our community. We have thousands of alumni. They want to help. How can we get them to help our students figure out their career pathway or figure out career advice, the stuff you didn't know when you were 20 years old? It's hard to know without doing it unless you have a mentor.
Yeah. What other advice would you give organizations that are looking to build a strong volunteer program?
You have to be really clear on defining the problem you want to solve. If you don't have that endpoint, you're never going to be able to create a plan to get there. So volunteering for volunteers' sake, there are some upsides to that. We can create relationships, we can build community, we can maybe that helps us on filling our donor pipeline, getting people more invested and involved with us. But it's a lot, a lot of footwork without something specific in mind. So once you are really clear on saying to yourself, um, I have a local animal rescue and 25 dogs a week are getting euthanized at my local shelter. My outcome I want to achieve with volunteers is to bring that number down to 10 or to 5. Then you can come up with the plan that will get you to that point and you can really execute.
Oh, that's scary. That to think of numbers like that. would be, I would want to get to 0. Just 5 euthanized pets. That's horrible. I know it's in your world. It's not my world, but I never think of it that way because I'm not around it. So
Yeah, I mean, it's like many of the things we do in nonprofit world. There are things out there that are ugly that we want to make beautiful, that we want to make right, that all goes to our purpose. But when we're really clear in that definition, we can actually create an action plan to do something about it instead of just feel crummy about it, or, you know, engage in advocacy that might not make much of a difference. We can be so action oriented in making that change, putting ourselves out of business. That's a great nonprofit objective you don't see often enough. Really doing the thing instead of just existing to exist.
have you ever seen a nonprofit go out of business because they put themselves out of business?
You know, there is a growing movement of some foundations to sunset themselves right now. I think the last few years, there have been so many challenges that we are called to answer. And foundations are in a really strong position to ask themselves, are we here to just solve problems in perpetuity? Or are we here to make a difference so that no one has to worry about this 50 years from now? I actually think that's a type of thinking that's often missing from the nonprofit
Yeah,
world.
yeah.
It's challenging because it's all about paradigm shifting and being quite futuristic. And most of us are not ingrained with the type of thinking or skills to do that. We might be purpose oriented, but we're still here to get a paycheck day after day. And putting ourselves out of a job is not the way most people approach their work. Fundamentally, most people can't do that. So there is a growing movement towards that. And I think it's important. There's also the effective altruism movement, which has really been growing in popularity over about the last 15 years or so. And they ask, why should we support nonprofits that aren't effective? Why should we support nonprofits that, have good intentions but don't have a lot to show for what they're doing, when we can say empirically, we know these amounts of donations can lead to these interventions at more effective nonprofits. So that sort of thinking is growing, but a lot of people still haven't been exposed to those sorts of nonprofit organizations or those lines of thought about our work.
Well, I like the questioning that you use, just for the ability it has to open up ideas that you hadn't thought of before. So, if you sat there and say, how could I put my nonprofit out of business? I like the ideas that it comes up with. It's an interesting perspective, don't you think?
Yeah, and I will say that question is relevant for some sorts of nonprofits, and it's not relevant for others. So higher education is a great example. We don't want the college experience to stop existing. We want to keep creating educated, skilled leaders for generations to come. We're always going to need that, right? But there are other types of nonprofits where the idea of putting ourselves out of business, I think that should definitely be the goal.
Yeah, I still think, even in the example of the higher education that you said, I think if I was a leader of that organization, I would say I still think it would be an interesting exercise, because it would lead me down the path of saying, well, maybe we don't need these buildings anymore. Maybe the amount of teachers we need isn't as much. Maybe the curriculum that we're providing is outdated. I'm not in that field, so I can't.
It is a relevant question to ask because we're currently hitting the enrollment cliff. So this has been predicted for a long time, around 2025, 2026, that the number of available young people to go to college would really start to decrease based on, demographic trends. And we've already seen a number of schools starting to go out of business, especially in regions that have too many schools for the number of population they have. So the Northeast has really been the example of that. But it goes to the heart of that, of why do we exist? How do we need to change over time our existence? It is rare, but some nonprofits do change what they do because they've solved one problem and they're on to the next. So having that thinking behind you is important, because I think we know the enemy of all good things is we're just doing the way we've always done things, right?
Yeah, and today's title of this podcast was "How to Build Strong Volunteer Programs to Match Your Mission, Values, and Goals." So, what does make a strong volunteer program in general? When you've seen strong programs, what is the core competency of that?
Yeah, so I would say there's two things that really matter. So it's having clear, defined outcomes and really understanding your relationships, community, and culture. So the defined outcomes piece goes back to the knowing the problem you want to solve. So it's one thing to say, I'm going to create a mentoring program. That's my goal. Okay, you created something, but what's it actually doing? What are your defined outcomes? So being really clear on those defined outcomes of, I want to connect 50 students to alumni mentors this year, or 10 students in our MBA program need to be connected to executives. Let's get really clear on what the thing is we want to happen, not just that something is existing here, right? This other piece is relationships and culture. We talked about this earlier. Volunteering is such a personal thing, so relational, that when we're coming up with volunteer programs, we can't overlook that. First and foremost, If we create a volunteer program no one shows up for, we've really missed the mark, right? So we have to be in conversation and collaboration with our volunteers to figure out what is going to move them. But we also have to align that with those defined outcomes for our programs so that we're doing something that matters. We're making the impact that we want to make. The other thing is like this culture fit. And when I say culture, I mean, coming up with a volunteer program that matches the way your organization works. If your organization is really siloed, there's a lot of politics at play, you have lots of units who might be involved around a volunteer program. As the volunteer manager, part of your program is learning how to navigate that and integrating all those different parts together. If you have an organization where everyone is involved in everything, you better make sure in your volunteer program that's how it goes too, right? So really just kind of finding those moments of this feels like this mirrors this in our organization will help it make sense and will help you find that alignment that fundamentally drives you to those outcomes you're looking to achieve.
So 2 last questions.
Mhm.
The first one is, and I'll give you both questions at the same time. The first one is, if you're a smaller organization and you want to start a volunteer program, what's the first priority that you would do? And the second question is, if you have an existing volunteer program and you want to make it stronger, what do you think you need to do? So let's start with the no volunteer program now. What's the top thing that you think you need to do?
You have to talk to your people. You have to have conversations with your stakeholders, with the board, with the people who are most likely to become your volunteers. Some of that is going to be idea generation, but some of that is also going to be about feasibility and whether it's worthwhile. How does this balance with your other responsibilities and strategic priorities? So, really doing that kind of surveying work is going to be critical because a volunteer program is a really good example of like shiny object syndrome, where it seems like a really great idea and sometimes it is and sometimes it's just more work than it's worth. And so focusing on that, knowing yourself, knowing your constituents, having those conversations, that's going to help you be really clear and decisive about whether or not volunteerism is right for your org and start to help you generating the ideas of what it could look like.
And for the second organization, which already has a volunteer program but wants to make it stronger, what would you advise them?
Yeah, so there's a number of things you can do. So you should be regularly surveying your volunteers to learn about what the experience is like for them, finding out, what's your volunteer retention rate? Are you keeping people? Are they happy with their experience? Um, are you meeting those defined goals and outcomes? If all of that is positive, that's a pretty good indicator that you're on the right track. And maybe it's just a matter of more is more. If you add some more volunteer managers, you can increase the number of volunteers you have. But if you're meeting your goals, you have great surveys, you're in a good place. You may think about growing it. You may not need to. It all goes back to that understanding of where does this complement our broader goals as an organization.
Yeah, it's all good stuff. What a great podcast. You did such a good job of explaining all this. I learned a lot, Perry.
Oh, I appreciate that.
I'd like to thank so very much Perry Radford from Rad Philanthropy for coming on to today's podcast. And if you like today's podcast, please feel free to share it with a friend and also subscribe on your favorite podcasting app. And if you like today's podcast or any of the other ones, please give us a 5-star rating review. It really helps us get the word out, although this podcast is the top 1% of podcasts in the nonprofit space. So we really thank you for that. And if you're looking for a line of credit for your organization, please visit our website at nonprofitmbapodcast.com. Perry, if anyone wants to get in touch with you, how would they go about doing that?
You can find me on LinkedIn or radphilanthropy.com.
Yeah, and it's RADFORD. So for those of you, so thanks for coming on, Perry. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
So I'd like to end today's podcast as I usually do by thanking all our listeners, not really as much for listening as much as for making the world a better place. Certainly in my lifetime, it's gotten harder and harder. There's so many complex problems out there, and you guys are out there on the front line. And I just want to remind you that you're no value to your employees, your cause, your family, your friends, if you don't take care of yourself first. That means everything. We all know what that means, exercising, eating right, praying or meditating, whatever you need to do to take care of yourself first. Because unfortunately, solving the world problems is a marathon and not a sprint. So please just think about that every day or every night when you wake up. I'm sorry, every night before you go to sleep or the next morning, think about what you need to do to take care of yourself first. You'll be helping the world if you do that first. Other than that, I want to thank you all for listening and thank you for listening for the Nonprofit MBA podcast. Have a great day, everybody.